Thanks very much for joining me. So you have a piece of legislation that is redistricting. It is the hot topic, and you put it in when? Exactly.
It's been in for several years now. It took some time to build momentum and educate my colleagues about what was in the bill. It's obviously a sensitive subject, both politically and substantively for everybody. But I think we're peaking at the right moment at a time when we only have 2 years until the reapportionment occurs, that the bill is getting the attention that it deserves right now.
But when you originally put it in, weren't people a little bit annoyed at you?
I wouldn't say annoyed. People are concerned, as they should be. It's something that affects the way we get elected. And I think people wanted to give it a significant amount of scrutiny, which they have now had a number of years to do. We've listened carefully to the input that our colleagues have provided us, and the bill's moving through the committee process, which is terrific.
Moving rapidly, well, rapidly, I mean moving unanimously today. It moved out of committee, it moved out of one committee, GovOps, right, Government Operations.
That's right.
And then moved to where?
To the Ways and Means Committee.
Okay, so that's the final stop before the floor?
At this time of year, the Rules Committee is between the Ways and Means and the floor, but yes, and it's in a similar position in the Senate where it has now passed through a couple of committees and is sitting in the Senate Finance Committee. So we're essentially one step away from floor activity in both houses.
Okay, I don't know necessarily that people really understand how monumental this is. I mean, this is a really, really big deal from a politically wonky point of view.
Right. And this is why I think you see so many of the reform efforts this year targeted towards this bill specifically. Both the New York Uprising group that Mayor Koch and the Citizens Union are involved in, and Andrew Cuomo himself have made this a significant part of their reform platform in this election year. And if I'm not mistaken, just about every statewide candidate has signed on to the fact that this specific piece of legislation is the way to achieve the redistricting reform we need to bring more accountability to our government.
Okay, so what we're talking about here really is competitive elections, because the way that the system is rigged now, for lack of a better word, is that these districts are gerrymandered. They are drawn specifically to help incumbents remain incumbents. If, in fact, the lines were drawn in a fair and nonpartisan process, which is what you're suggesting, how many people do you think would lose their seats?
Well, it's impossible to tell. What I tell everyone is if someone is a diligent, hardworking colleague, as I think most of my colleagues are, they shouldn't have a problem. Maybe some more work for all of us, because it's more likely that we would have challengers and some of the advantages of a gerrymandered process would be gone. But what I've seen in my experience in government and in politics is someone who's hardworking, honest, doing a good job is always returned to office by the people who appreciate their representation.
But don't you worry, actually, or aren't some of your colleagues worried that when you redraw the lines, you're actually going to create not just challengers, but head-to-head contests between your colleagues, between one person and another? Now, you're leaving the Assembly to go into the Senate to take a seat of George Gianaris, who's retiring, so you don't really have to worry about challenges, not this time at any rate. But couldn't it conceivably end up that you have head-to-head matches between people who are friends and colleagues?
Well, this wouldn't take effect till 2 years from now, which is when the reapportionment occurs, so I'd be just as subject to any changes as anybody else at that time. But it's a concern, and what we're really trying to do is remove the politicization of the process, in a political process, as much as possible. And the bill does that in two distinct ways. Number one, it sets up this commission, because right now the legislators ourselves, we sit there and we draw the lines together with staff and end up voting on it. So we would try and set up a commission that is at least 1 or 2 levels removed from the legislature to draw the lines, and then we change the criteria under which the lines are drawn as well to both narrow the difference between districts and population, which has been manipulated in the past to give one party an advantage over another, and also to remove the ability to use political concerns, whether it's to favor one party over the other or one incumbent over a challenger, in the reapportionment process. What's interesting to note is that enough of my colleagues now have gotten elected after overcoming a gerrymandering that was targeted specifically to them. Hakeem Jeffries comes to mind specifically, who was in a documentary about this. Adriano Espaillat has a similar story. That a lot of the support we've seen coming up from my colleagues has been people who have suffered at the hands of gerrymandering.
Sure, and actually Eric Schneiderman is another, he's leaving the Senate to run for State Attorney General. He comes to mind for me as an example that the Republicans redistricted him, pushing his district very far north and into Washington Heights, was a predominantly Spanish-speaking area, and he countered that by learning how to speak Spanish.
Right.
I mean, certainly it can be done, and it's possible, but it also, it should be noted that you also, the legislature, which I don't know that everyone knows, draws the lines for the Congress. So are you hearing, what are you hearing from your congressional colleagues down in Washington? I mean, they can't be pleased about this.
Well, I have not heard anything specifically at this time. I'm sure they've expressed their concerns and they're monitoring the situation. But at the end of the day, a fair process benefits everybody. And when the public has faith in its government, we all benefit. And right now, what we're seeing across the board, and it was reflected in the Quinnipiac poll just yesterday, the public does not have faith in the process by which we're elected, and specifically due to the gerrymandering and the reapportionment process that we're using.
But how fair can you can't really say, well, we're going to take politics out of this entirely. I mean, just, I think it was maybe a month ago, you see Senate President Malcolm Smith saying, well, once, in a closed setting, in a partisan setting, in a meeting of fellow Democrats saying, well, we have to keep control of the Senate, where there's a lot of concern because there's so much that's so close over there with just 2 seats. And you're going over there, so good luck to you. But I'm sorry. But he said, well, we're going to redistrict the Republicans into oblivion. I mean, that's why the battle is so heated this year for that control of that chamber, because just given the way the enrollment works in New York, the Republicans really could become an endangered species. How can you assure that there's not going to be any politics? You can't make the process devoid of politics.
No,
it's not possible.
Of course not. But what we can do is set the criteria in such a way that the lines are legally required to be drawn certain ways. And if we say in the law of New York State that the lines cannot be drawn in such a way as to favor one political party over another, or an incumbent over to the exclusion of a challenger, then that could become the basis for a court challenge to lines that are drawn in the other way.
But that's very vague. I mean, don't you think it's actually going to end up in the court? Because to say this line can't be drawn so as to benefit another person, the interpretation of that, I mean, it's just wide open.
Well, we're almost always in court every 10 years on
That's
reapportionment for one reason or another. And so this would just give more ammunition to create a fairer process. What I would say as it relates to the Senate on this, and I'm not a senator, they're going to make their own decisions on this as they should. But at a point where there's uncertainty as to who might control the body next year, this actually benefits both parties, because a fair process would not allow either one of them to gerrymander the other into oblivion or in any other way, depending on who's in control or who's not next year.
Don't you also run up, though,